You'll have to run me over first. I told my kids when they brought a bulldozer into my garden. Just a few days later, scientists discovered an endangered species growing there. I heard the car doors before I saw their faces. The morning had started with the kettle rattling on the stove and the smell of damp rosemary rising from my sleeves, but the sound of laughter on the gravel cut through all that. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the front door. There they were, my Danny in his blue sport coat that never quite fit across the shoulders, my Elaine with her hair sprayed into a helmet, and a tall fellow in a crisp suit holding a rolled map like a baton. The three of them stood in a row, shining shoes and city cologne more than the sun ever could. "Mom, you're up," Danny said like I was a lazy teenager. "Good. We brought Mr. Cole. He's with Oak Ridge Development. He's got some very generous numbers." Mr. Cole stepped forward and took off his sunglasses, slow as a movie star. "Mrs. Turner," he said, smiling like his teeth had been ironed. "A pleasure. I've heard a great deal about your property." "Home," I said, with a little more steel than I planned. "It's my home." Elaine rolled her eyes so hard I could hear it. "We don't want a scene today, Mother. We're just talking. You know what the market is doing. We're doing you a favor, honestly." They crowded in apace, and beyond them the garden leaned toward the house like an eavesdropper. September light slid along the bee balm and the old quince tree. The path was muddied from last night's sprinkling can, and my gloves hung on the fence post like sleeping birds. Mr. Cole clicked open his tube and shook out a paper. Lines, boxes, and neat numbers covered all that once was wild and faithful. He laid the map across my porch swing, pushing aside the cushion I'd mended for the third time this summer. 42 units, he said, tapping with his pen. Townhouses. Thoughtful density. Green space here. Green space, I repeated, tasting the words like dry crackers. Danny laughed, the quick, embarrassed laugh he uses when he thinks I'm being difficult. "You can keep a little herb patch, Ma. Or I don't know, plant those, what do you call them? Those weeds you like." Elaine joined him. "Your collection of weeds," she said, and Mr. Cole smiled with them, polite as a waiter overhearing a private joke. "Not weeds," I said. I didn't say the names out loud, didn't give them the dignity of an audience that would turn them to punchlines. But in my head the syllables clicked like rosary beads. Ladies' tresses, ginseng, ghost pipe, wild ginger. The old ones. The stubborn ones. The ones who kept me company when the house was too quiet and the clock was the only voice. Mr. Cole cleared his throat. "We'd like to make an offer you'll find very fair. Given the size we're prepared to start at." "Start," I said. "You're at my door telling me how it ends." Elaine's cheeks flushed. She tucked hair behind her ear and trained her smile on me like a flashlight. "Mother, you can't keep this up. The taxes alone." "Paid," I said. "On the dot." Danny's eyes slid past me to the kitchen window, where the lace curtain shivered in the breeze. "You're 70, Ma. You shouldn't be mowing, lifting, worrying about broken pipes. Think about Florida. Condos by the water. You'd have friends, elevators, a doorman." I looked down the path to the old oak where my Henry had hung a tire swing before Danny lost his first tooth. The rope scar still ran along the branch, a pale stripe like a healed wound. "I have friends," I said. "They have roots." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Elaine muttered. Mr. Cole kept his smile, but his eyes sobered. "Mrs. Turner, I understand attachment. But this is an opportunity. Oak Ridge prides itself on working with families. We can close quickly, cash, and we'll even move any special flowers you'd like to keep. There are landscapers for that." "Landscapers," I said. "Can they move the soil under the soil? The quiet knots the earth keeps?" "Mother," Elaine snapped, the polite shell cracking. "Please, don't start in with your poetry. We're not the villains here. This is about security. For you. For all of us." "Security like fences," I said. Around places that used to be open. Danny folded his arms. So you're just saying no? Without even hearing the number? I don't need the number to know the cost. His jaw worked. I saw the boy who'd once kicked his heel against the table leg when he didn't get his way. We've already talked to the county, Ma. Zoning's ready. They're excited. This neighborhood's changing whether you like it or not. Mr. Cole nodded, easing the rolled plans back into their tube. There's momentum, he said. I don't want you to miss the train. The kettle in the kitchen started its thin whistle. I didn't move. This house was boards and dust when we came. Henry and I planted every blade you're standing on. That gate was built from his workbench. My thumbprints are in the cement under your feet. If I sell, I'm selling pieces of people who aren't here to protest. Elaine looked past me toward the hallway, where his photograph hangs. Henry in his grease-stained cap, a wrench on his shoulder like a rifle. Something flickered in her face, then went out. It's been 15 years, she said, not cruelly, not kindly. We're alive. We have lives. And you'll keep them, I said. Right down my throat. The whistle grew into a shriek. I let it howl. No. The three of them went very still, as if I had thrown a plate that somehow hovered midair. Mr. Cole broke first, smoothing his tie. I'm sorry to hear that, he said. We'll give you some time to reconsider. No, I repeated. You can take your map off my porch. Danny's face hardened into a stranger's. You're being selfish, Ma. If that word means keeping the last thing I can still call mine, then yes, I said. Get off my steps. Elaine's mouth opened, closed. We'll be back, she said quietly, with a better offer. You bring whatever you like, I said, and finally turned toward the screaming kettle. I'll bring the gate. The next morning, I woke to a strange rumble under the earth. At first, I thought it was thunder rolling over the hills. But thunder doesn't come with diesel smoke and the sound of gears grinding. When I stepped out onto my porch, still in my housecoat, I saw it. An orange bulldozer crawling down the road like some great hungry beast, my children walking alongside it with satisfied smirks. Behind them followed the developer, a man in a shiny suit, his hands tucked smugly into his pockets. They hadn't even come to talk this time. They had come to act. The bulldozer groaned to a stop right at my gate. Its massive blade gleamed in the morning light, pointed straight at my oldest lilac bush. I could feel my pulse in my temples. That lilac had been planted by my late husband the spring our first child was born. And now that same child stood there with arms folded, waiting for it to be torn from the earth like a weed. You had your chance, Ma, my eldest son barked. We told you we can't waste good land on this nonsense. It's happening today. I shook my head, stepping forward until I stood square in the gate. My slippers pressed into the gravel, but I didn't move aside. This garden is my life's work, I said. Not a scrap of it will be touched while I'm still breathing. They laughed. My daughter, always quick with sharp words, muttered something about drama, and the developer gave a half-smile like he was enjoying a show. Then the engine roared to life. The bulldozer's blade began to lower. I don't know where the strength came from, but I threw myself forward right in front of that machine. The ground trembled as its tracks inched closer, dirt grinding under their weight. My hands flew up in a wild wave. Stop! I screamed, my voice cracking but carrying across the street. You'll have to run me down before you touch a single branch here. The operator hesitated. He leaned out of the cab, uncertainty plain on his face. But my children shouted at him. Go on. Don't listen to her. I planted my feet. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might give out right there. But if it did, let it be here in front of my garden. The commotion must have carried further than I thought, because soon neighbors began appearing. Old Mr. Carter from across the street leaned on his cane at the edge of his driveway. Then the Thompson kids came running barefoot, their mother calling after them. By the time a full minute passed, half the block was standing in front of my fence, whispering, pointing, watching. The sound of that machine, idling hot and impatient, filled the silence until I found my breath again. "This is illegal," I shouted. "I'm calling the police." And I did. With shaking hands, I pulled my telephone from my apron pocket. I always carried it, though I'd hoped never to need it for this. My voice trembled as I told the dispatcher, "They're trying to bulldoze my land without permission. Send someone. Please hurry." When I hung up, my children's faces had hardened. "You've gone too far, Mother," my son hissed. "You're humiliating us in front of the whole neighborhood." "Better humiliation than destruction," I snapped back. It didn't take long for the blue and red lights to flash down the road. The police car pulled up with a screech, and 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts. The neighbors leaned in closer now, murmuring like a crowd at a carnival. The officer in front raised his hand. "What's going on here?" My son stepped forward first, quick to claim the floor. "Our mother refuses to sell this property. We brought in machinery to clear space. She's making a scene." I cut him off before the officer could even nod. "They're trying to destroy my garden," I cried. "This is my home. My land. I never signed a paper, never agreed to a sale. They brought a bulldozer onto my property without my permission." The officer's brows furrowed. He turned to the developer. "Do you have a legal order to enter this property?" The man in the shiny suit hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other. "Well, not exactly, but we—" "That's enough," the officer said sharply. "Shut that machine down. Now." The bulldozer's engine sputtered, then went silent. The neighbors clapped, some cheering openly. My knees nearly gave way from the relief of that sound. But even in victory, I saw the storm still brewing in my children's eyes. My daughter spat the words at me like venom. "You'll regret this, Ma. You can't keep this up forever." Maybe not, I thought. But for that morning I had held the line. And as the crowd lingered at the fence, whispers buzzing like bees, I realized something important. This fight was no longer just mine. It had become public. The garden had witnesses now. And sometimes witnesses change everything. After the bulldozer threat, the garden was never quiet again. Neighbors stopped at the gate daily, bringing casseroles or just their curious eyes. Journalists began showing up too, pressing cameras through the fence, calling my name like I was a spectacle at the county fair. My children kept their distance for a while, licking their wounds, but I knew they were plotting. I felt it in the air. One afternoon, while I was kneeling by the columbines with dirt under my nails, a voice broke through the fence. "Excuse me, ma'am, could I come in?" I looked up to see a young man, barely more than a boy really, with a mop of curly hair and glasses sliding down his nose. He held a battered satchel stuffed with books. Not the kind of fellow I usually saw hanging around the gate. "Who are you?" I asked, standing slowly, brushing soil from my knees. "My name's Peter," he said quickly. "Peter Lang. I study botany at the university. I read about the commotion in the papers. They said you've got a collection of wild species here, so I wanted to see if I might be allowed to look." There was something earnest in his eyes. Not greedy, not mocking, just hungry for knowledge. After a moment, I nodded and unlatched the gate. "Come on then, but mind your shoes. This is no place for trampling." He followed me along the winding path, his head swiveling as though he'd stepped into another world. He bent down at every bed, murmuring names under his breath, Latin names long and twisting, but with a tenderness like he was greeting old friends. When we reached the far corner, the one where the earth stays damp and cool even in August, he stopped dead. His satchel slipped from his shoulder, spilling notebooks into the grass. "Good Lord," he whispered. He crouched low, eyes fixed on a single stalk that leaned delicately among the ferns. its pale flowers curved like lanterns, almost glowing in the shadow. Do you know it? I asked, puzzled by the way he trembled. He looked up at me, face flushed. Know it? Ma'am, this might be Cypripedium calceolus, a lady's slipper orchid. They're nearly extinct in this part of the world. I've only ever seen sketches. I frowned. Extinct? You mean rare? Rare doesn't begin to cover it. His voice shook with excitement. This plant is listed in the International Red Book. If it's truly what I think it is, your garden isn't just a curiosity. It's protected. It's priceless. The words hit me harder than a hammer. Protected. Priceless. I knelt beside him, looking at the fragile bloom swaying in the light. I had tended it for years without knowing its name. To me it was simply one of my quiet companions, something Henry and I had once carried from a shady forest walk decades ago. Before I could ask more, a sharp voice cut across the path. What's going on here? I turned to see my daughter storming in through the open gate, her heels snapping against the stones. Behind her marched my son, his fists already clenched, and the developer, face tight with suspicion. They must have been waiting for a chance to catch me off guard. Who is this? My daughter demanded, jabbing a finger at Peter. Another one of your cronies trying to stir up trouble? Peter scrambled to his feet, stammering. I'm just a student. Fraud, my son barked. He strode forward, snatching the orchid stalk in his fist. I gasped, rushing to stop him, but he only pointed at it like evidence. This is a weed, Ma. Nothing more. Don't let some kid with a notebook fill your head with nonsense. Please, Peter cried. Don't touch it. You could damage. Enough, my daughter snapped. She grabbed Peter's satchel and flung it against the fence. Notebooks flew open, pages fluttering like panicked birds. You're trespassing. We could have you arrested. The boy's face burned red, but his voice held steady. You can try, but this plant is real. I'll bring back proof. Scientists will confirm it. And then you won't be able to bulldoze anything here. The word bulldoze made the neighbors perk up. They were gathered again outside the gate, watching, listening. I saw the journalists' 2 cameras flashing. Every cruel gesture of my children was caught in their lenses. You hear that? I said, my voice trembling but clear. He'll bring scientists. And when they come, this garden will show its truth. The developer cursed under his breath, but my children dragged him away before the cameras pressed closer. Peter bent to gather his scattered papers, and I helped him, my hands shaking. I'm sorry, he murmured. I didn't mean to cause such a scene. I pressed the last notebook into his hands. Don't you apologize. You gave me hope. He nodded firmly. I'll be back with professors this time. They won't be able to laugh it away. When he left through the gate, the neighbors whispered in a hum of speculation. The journalists scribbled furiously. And I stood there in the fading light, gazing at that fragile orchid, realizing that for the first time, the garden itself had spoken, and what it said could change everything. The scientists came sooner than I expected. 2 days after Peter's visit, a van rolled up to my gate, its sides marked with the green seal of the state university. Out stepped 3 figures, a woman with silver-streaked hair carrying a camera, a tall man with soil-stained boots, and a younger fellow in a lab coat far too clean for our dirt roads. Peter trailed behind them, breathless, as if he'd run the whole way from town. This is Mrs. Turner, he introduced proudly. The one who kept the garden. I nodded, wary but hopeful, as they unloaded cases and notebooks. The neighbors gathered again, whispering like it was Sunday service. Even the journalists returned, microphones angled toward the gate. My children weren't far behind either. I saw them striding up the walk with tight jaws, the developer in tow, his tie crooked from haste. The scientists barely glanced at the crowd. They moved with purpose, crouching at beds, pulling out magnifiers, muttering Latin. The silver-haired woman clipped photographs with a click, click, click. The man in boots scooped soil into bags, and the young one scribbled furiously. "This is incredible," the woman murmured. "Some of these specimens haven't been catalogued in this region for 50 years. I stood straighter, pride swelling in my chest. But just then a sharp crack split the air. I spun around to see my son yanking a bush from the ground near the lilacs. Roots tore up with a sickening rip. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "Cleaning up," he said coldly. "Don't want the scientists wasting time on weeds." The journalists gasped, cameras snapping. Neighbors yelled, "Leave it be." But my daughter joined him, grabbing a spade and striking at a cluster of ferns like they were enemies in a war. Peter lunged forward to stop them, but the developer pulled him back by the collar. "Let them clear it," he sneered. "Less confusion." "Confusion," the silver-haired scientist barked. "You're destroying evidence." She marched over, her camera raised like a weapon. "Every plant here is part of the ecosystem. You can't touch a thing without our documentation." My children froze, caught between rage and the flashing eyes of the crowd. My daughter dropped the spade with a clang, but not before one delicate stalk had been bent nearly in half. I rushed to it, cradling the bruised stem like a broken bone. "Monsters," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if they heard. The scientists pressed on, working into the afternoon. They marked off sections with bright tape, set up lights, and spoke in low, urgent tones. I trailed behind, answering questions as best I could. How long I'd tended certain beds, where each plant came from, what years they first bloomed. My memories became their records, my hands their guide. By evening, they had gathered enough to fill 3 cases. The woman finally looked at me, her face both stern and kind. "We'll need to run tests," she said. "DNA analysis, comparison with herbarium records. But I can tell you this, what you have here isn't ordinary. If our suspicions are correct, this garden could qualify as protected land under international law." The words rang in the air like church bells. Protected land. International law. My knees nearly buckled. But my children weren't finished. "This is a circus," my daughter hissed, rounding on the scientists. "She planted these weeds years ago and now you're letting her trick you. This is all staged, an old woman's fantasy." The silver-haired scientist didn't flinch. "Science doesn't bend to tantrums," she said flatly. "If the data confirms our findings, no bulldozer on Earth will touch this soil." The crowd erupted in cheers, and I felt a spark of something I hadn't known in years: vindication. Still, I saw the look my son gave me across the path, his eyes dark with something heavier than anger. It was a promise of more trouble to come. As the van doors shut and the scientists drove off with their cases of samples, the garden grew quiet again. But it wasn't the old quiet of bees and wind in the leaves. No, it was a charged silence, the kind that comes just before lightning splits the sky. I pressed my hand to the soil, whispering to the roots, "Hold steady now. The fight isn't over." The letter arrived in the Morning Post, but by noon the news had already spread faster than fire on dry leaves. I hadn't even opened the envelope when neighbors began knocking, voices buzzing with excitement. By the time I slit the flap with my paring knife, 2 journalists were waiting at the gate, microphones dangling like bait. Inside, the words were simple, clinical, but they struck like thunder. Confirmed. Specimen identified as Cypripedium calceolus, commonly known as lady's slipper orchid. Status: endangered. Listed in the International Red Book of Threatened Species. I read it twice, then a third time, my hands trembling. Protected. Recognized. The garden wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the world. The reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Turner, how does it feel? Will you open the garden to the public? Do you realize the value of what you've been protecting?" I stood at the fence clutching the letter, my knees weak but my voice steady. "This garden has always been valuable," I said. Now the world finally agrees. The crowd cheered, some clapping, some crying. But behind them my children pushed forward, their faces pale with panic. This is ridiculous, my daughter barked. One flower doesn't make this land holy. You're being duped by opportunists. Duped? A neighbor shouted back. It's science. You just lost your payday, another called, and laughter rippled through the crowd. My son tried to snatch the letter from my hands, but the journalists shoved their cameras between us. Flashbulbs popped. Is it true you plan to bulldoze an endangered plant? One reporter demanded. Were you aware of your mother's collection before this discovery? My son's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The developer tried to smooth things over, raising his hands. There must be a mistake, he said quickly. These reports aren't final. Let's not jump to conclusions. But no one was listening to him anymore. The neighbors were chanting, "Save the garden! Save the garden!" And the journalists were broadcasting live, microphones lit with red dots. I slipped back through the gate, closing it firmly behind me. The chant followed me into the garden, rolling like a tide. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. But peace doesn't last long when money is involved. That evening, my daughter barged into the house without knocking. Her perfume filled the kitchen before she even spoke. Do you know what you've done? She hissed. Developers are pulling out. Investors are gone. Do you realize how much money we just lost because of you? I poured myself a cup of tea, steadying my hands. I didn't lose a thing. I kept what mattered. Her eyes narrowed, sharp as knives. This isn't over, Mother. You can't hide behind some plant. We'll fight this. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the cups rattled in the cupboard. By nightfall, the telephone began ringing. Reporters, scientists, even strangers from across the country, all wanting to talk, to visit, to praise. Some offered money, others demanded interviews. My garden had become a headline, and I, a reluctant guardian. But alone in the quiet hours, I walked the paths with a lantern, brushing leaves with my fingertips, whispering to the roots. You're safe now, I told them, though part of me wondered if that was true. For safety isn't just about laws or recognition. Safety means fending off greed, even when it wears your children's faces. The next morning, I saw them through the window, my son and daughter at the fence, arguing with each other, their voices sharp. They hadn't expected their plan to collapse. And now that it had, I knew desperation would drive them to darker schemes. Still, when I knelt by the orchids, lantern light falling across their delicate petals, I felt something new. Not just hope, strength. The world knew now. The world was watching. And for once, my children weren't the only ones holding power. The summons came folded in a stiff white envelope, its ink as cold as my children's voices. They were suing me. Fraud, fabrication, mental unfitness, their claims stacked up like bricks in a wall meant to box me in. According to their lawyers, I'd staged the discovery, fake documents, and misled scientists. They said the garden wasn't rare at all, just weeds and delusion. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands. 70 years of tending soil, of planting cuttings with Henry, of nursing each fragile bloom, and now I was being called a liar in front of the world. The first court hearing drew a crowd so large it spilled down the courthouse steps. Neighbors came with hand-painted signs. Save the garden. Protect what's rare. Reporters jostled with microphones, their voices sharp. My children swept past them in polished shoes and pressed suits, their lawyer flanking them like a guard dog. I walked in slower, leaning on the same cane Henry had carved for me when my hip gave out years ago. At my side was Peter, the young student, carrying a stack of notes and photographs. Behind him came the silver-haired scientist, her camera slung across her shoulder, ready to fight with evidence instead of fists. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume, cologne, and the musk of too many bodies crammed into wooden benches. The judge, a stern man with lines etched deep in his cheeks, adjusted his glasses and began. My children's lawyer went first, painting me as a confused old woman. "She's 70, he said, his voice smooth as butter. "Her mind is not what it once was. This so-called rare species was discovered by a student with no credentials, and she leapt at the fantasy. My clients believe she has either been manipulated, or she has manipulated others." The words stung, but worse was the way my children sat nodding, as though they believed every poisoned syllable. When it was our turn, the silver-haired scientist rose. Her voice carried clear across the courtroom. "We conducted thorough tests," she said, laying photographs and lab results on the judge's desk. "DNA analysis confirmed the specimen. There is no fabrication. This plant is internationally recognized as endangered. The garden is a living archive." Peter added his testimony, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as he spoke of the moment he saw the orchid bloom. "I've studied botany for years," he said. "I know weeds. This was no weed." The judge listened, his face unreadable, while the reporters scribbled every word. When my turn came, I stood slowly, cane in hand. My knees threatened to buckle, but I forced my back straight. "I never asked for this fight," I said. "I never planted my garden to make money or headlines. I planted it to keep alive what my husband and I cherished. My children may call them weeds, but every root has a history, every bloom a memory. If protecting that makes me a liar in their eyes, so be it. But the truth is right outside, growing still, whether you believe me or not." For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. Then the gallery erupted. Neighbors clapping, journalists snapping photographs, the chant of "Save the Garden" spilling into the air until the judge had to pound his gavel to restore order. The case dragged on for weeks. Each day new accusations flew. My children claimed I forged the letter from the scientists, that I'd bribed them for recognition. They tried to dig into my finances, hunting for secrets that didn't exist. But each time the evidence stood firm. The garden spoke louder than their greed. One morning, a journalist cornered my son on the courthouse steps, asking why he was fighting so hard to destroy something the world valued. He snapped, "Because it's our land too, and we deserve profit." The words blared across headlines by nightfall. Children sue mother over priceless garden. The tide began to turn. Supporters gathered daily outside the courthouse, chanting and singing, waving signs painted with flowers. Letters poured in from around the world, scientists, activists, ordinary people who had never met me but felt the fight was theirs too. And through it all, my children's faces grew darker, their voices sharper. They hadn't expected resistance, hadn't thought an old woman with dirt under her nails could stand against them. But I wasn't standing alone anymore. The war in the courts wasn't finished, but each day I walked out with the sun on my face and the crowd cheering, I felt stronger. The garden had rooted itself not only in my soil but in the hearts of strangers. And that, I realized, was power my children could never bulldoze. The court hearings dragged on, but the garden didn't wait for verdicts. Spring rolled in, and with it came new blooms, stubborn and unbothered by human quarrels. Every morning I walked the paths with my cane, lantern in hand if the sun was still low, and I felt the earth whisper secrets I hadn't noticed before. One morning, the silver-haired scientists returned with a small team. They carried not just notebooks this time, but vials, microscopes, and strange machines that hummed when set against the soil. Peter trailed behind, grinning like a boy at Christmas. "Mrs. Turner," the scientist said, "we've had requests from pharmaceutical researchers. They want to study what else may be growing here. With your permission." She gestured to the equipment. "Go ahead," I said, though my heart beat faster. The thought of strangers digging around my garden made me anxious, but curiosity outweighed fear. They set to work, crouching among the herbs I had tended for decades. I watched them pluck leaves, scrape bark, test sap. Hours passed, the air filled with the murmur of Latin words and the click of glass against glass. Then, just as the sun reached its peak, one of the younger researchers let out a cry. "Professor, you need to see this." We hurried over. In her hand she held a cluster of tiny star-shaped flowers, pale as milk, with a fragrance so faint it barely brushed the air. "I've seen those for years," I said. "I make tea from the dried petals. Good for settling the stomach." The scientist bent close, her face alight with wonder. "This is Gentiana alba. But look, the chemical composition is unusual. These specimens have an alkaloid concentration I've never recorded before." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," she said slowly, "that your garden may hold compounds no one has studied. Medicinal compounds. This could be the foundation for treatments, new medicines worth millions." Millions. The word hit me like a stone. Not because I wanted the money, but because I knew what it would do to my children when they heard it. The news spread within days. Pharmaceutical companies sent letters, then lawyers. Offers poured in, thick envelopes promising sums I couldn't even read without shaking. My children, once desperate to flatten the garden, now turned sweet as sugar. They came to my door with smiles plastered on, speaking of family unity and sharing the blessing. "We could all profit, Ma," my son said one evening, his hand resting on the table as if he owned it. "You'd live like a queen. No more worries." I looked him in the eye, seeing not the boy who once swung on the tire Henry hung, but a man whose hunger had hollowed him out. "I've lived rich enough already," I said. "Rich in the smell of lilacs, the taste of tomatoes off the vine. That's all I ever needed." He slammed his fist down. "Don't be selfish. This is bigger than you." But the neighbors had heard by then too. They began guarding the gates, bringing folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, keeping watch so no one could sneak in. "We'll help you, Mrs. Turner," they said. "This belongs to all of us now." Reporters kept coming, their headlines growing more dramatic. "Grandmother's garden may cure disease. Miracle herbs discovered in small-town backyard." I couldn't step onto the porch without a camera flashing, but inside the garden walls I still found peace. The plants didn't care about money, about courts, about headlines. They just grew steady and sure the way they always had. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the sky, I sat beside the lady's slipper orchid. Its petals glowed faintly, fragile yet unbroken, and I felt tears sting my eyes. All my life I'd been called foolish for tending this patch of earth. Weeds, they said. Useless weeds. And now the very same weeds might heal the sick, save lives, change the world. Henry would have laughed at that, the kind of deep-belly laugh that shook the windows. I could almost hear it in the rustle of leaves. But even in my joy I felt a shadow pressing in. For treasures draw not only wonder but greed. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me, that my children weren't finished fighting. The garden had revealed its hidden wealth. Now the battle to protect it would only grow harder. It was the journalists who uncovered it first, not the scientists, not the lawyers. A young woman from the local paper came knocking one afternoon, her notebook clutched tight to her chest. She was nervous, but her eyes burned with determination. "Mrs. Turner," she said, "you need to hear this. We've been digging through records on Oak Ridge development. And your children, they've been taking money from them for months." Her words sank heavy into me, like stones tossed into deep water. I asked her to sit, poured her a cup of tea, though my hands shook as I set the kettle down. She opened her notebook, pages crowded with names, dates, and amounts. "Payments," she said, tapping the ink. "Your son and daughter each received monthly transfers from accounts tied to Oak Ridge. Right up until the day the bulldozer came." I felt my chest tighten. It was one thing for them to want the land, to mock my garden, to call it weeds. But bribes? To sell me out like property in a ledger? "Are you sure?" I whispered. She nodded. There's more. Oak Ridge has a history. This isn't the first time they've tried to seize land with rare or protected species. 10 years ago, down in Pine Hollow, a grove of century-old oaks was mysteriously cut down before surveyors arrived. Last year in Willow Creek, wetlands were drained overnight. And each time, the company claimed ignorance while family members conveniently signed land away. The pieces clicked together like cruel puzzle parts. My children hadn't just turned against me out of greed. They'd been bought long before, their pockets lined with promises. That evening, the journalist's story went to print. By morning, it was everywhere: front pages, radio chatter, even television crews parked outside my gate. Children of rare plant guardian accused of developer bribes. The crowd at my fence doubled overnight. Neighbors came with signs, chanting louder than ever. Strangers arrived too, carrying flowers, letters, prayers. One woman pressed my hand through the slats and said, "Don't let them win. You're fighting for all of us." My children, meanwhile, tried to disappear. But reporters hounded them, cornering them in parking lots, trailing them to work. When asked about the payments, my daughter snapped, "They were gifts." My son muttered, "Business arrangements." But the words sounded hollow even to them. One evening they appeared at my door, their faces pale and drawn. My son's tie was loose, his hair unkempt, my daughter's eyes ringed with shadows. They looked less like victors, more like children caught with jam on their hands. "You didn't have to sick the press on us," my son muttered, though his voice lacked its old sharpness. "I didn't," I said quietly. "The truth found its way without me." "You're ruining us," my daughter spat, but it came out weak, as though she no longer believed the words herself. "No," I said. "You ruined yourselves when you sold your mother's trust to men with bulldozers." They stood there, trembling on the porch, but when I closed the door, they didn't knock again. The next day, more revelations surfaced. Journalists dug deeper into Oak Ridge's files, exposing patterns of fraud, false permits, and under-the-table deals with local officials. It wasn't just my garden they had tried to erase, it was a dozen places like it, each silenced under the weight of money. The world began to turn against them. Environmental groups stepped in, offering lawyers, petitions, banners. A petition titled "Protect Turner's Garden" gathered thousands of signatures in days. Scientists published open letters, warning that destroying such a site would be an irreversible crime against biodiversity. For the first time, I wasn't the one defending the garden. Others were standing shoulder to shoulder with me, raising their voices higher than I ever could. But victory carried its own sorrow. Each headline about the bribes cut me like glass. My children, my own flesh, had chosen greed over blood, bulldozers over memory. And though the world now called me a guardian, a hero, inside I was just a mother mourning the betrayal that money had carved into my family. Still, as I walked the paths that evening, lantern casting warm circles of light on the blooms, I whispered to the plants, "We're not alone anymore. The truth is on our side." The garden rustled back, leaves trembling as though in agreement. And for the first time in weeks I believed it. The final hearing felt less like a trial and more like a theater. Every bench packed, the air thick with whispers. Cameras flashed as I made my slow way down the aisle, cane steady, chin lifted. Behind me walked Peter, the scientists, neighbors, even the journalist who'd uncovered the bribes. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they were family in a way blood had failed to be. Across the room sat my children, stiff in their suits. My daughter's jaw was tight, her lipstick a hard slash of red. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. Between them, the developer shifted in his chair, sweat shining at his temples. The judge called the court to order. Their lawyer went first, his voice still slick as oil though it carried less confidence than before. "Your Honor, we contend that Mrs. Turner is unfit to manage this property. Her age, her declining health, and her susceptibility to outside influence make her incapable of stewardship." This so-called discovery is exaggerated at best, fabricated at worst. The land should be entrusted to her children, responsible adults with the resources to make proper use of it. I felt my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, squeeze my shoulder from the bench behind. Then came our turn. The silver-haired scientist rose, her camera in hand. She laid photographs across the judge's desk. Petals luminous, roots delicate, leaves marked with intricate patterns no weed could mimic. These are no fantasies, she said firmly. They are living endangered species recognized by international law. This garden is a sanctuary. To destroy it would be a crime against nature. Next came Peter, nervous but determined. He spoke of the first time he'd seen the orchid, how his breath had caught, how science itself had demanded he act. I may be young, he said, but truth has no age. What grows in that soil is rare beyond measure. And she, he gestured toward me, has kept it alive for decades without applause, without profit, just devotion. The courtroom stirred. I saw my children shift uneasily. The journalist took the stand next, her voice sharp. She recounted the money trails, the bribes from Oak Ridge, the pattern of destroyed lands. She held up bank records, each page stamped and signed. This was never about care, she said. It was about cash. They sold their mother out before a single survey was made. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge's brow furrowed deeper. Finally, it was my turn. I rose slowly, leaning hard on Henry's cane. My voice wasn't loud, but the silence made it carry. I may be 70, I said, but I am not unfit. I remember every plant in that garden when it was planted, how it bloomed, what soil it favored. My children call it weeds. I call it life. If that makes me foolish, then I've been foolish happily all my days. But I will not hand this land over to those who see only dollar signs where petals grow. For a long moment the judge said nothing. Then he leaned forward, his voice grave. This court recognizes the findings of the scientific community. The Turner Garden is hereby designated protected land under state and international law. Furthermore, legal guardianship shall remain with Mrs. Turner, whose stewardship has proven invaluable. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed. The gavel fell like thunder. The room erupted, cheers, applause, reporters scrambling for quotes. My children sat frozen, their faces pale, as though the ground had dropped from under them. The developer buried his head in his hands. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me. The garden was safe. My life's work had been spared. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt truly unbroken. The morning after the verdict, I walked the garden path with the sun still low, dew glistening like pearls on every leaf. For once, there were no shouts at the gate, no reporters leaning over the fence. Just birdsong and the rustle of branches. Peace, real peace. But it didn't last long. By midday, the mailman delivered a bundle so thick I thought it might topple me. Letters from strangers across the country, some from overseas. Children had drawn pictures of flowers with crayons. Scientists wrote of collaborations. Families sent prayers and thanks. "You've saved something for all of us," one note said. The newspapers called me the guardian of the garden. My name, an old woman's name, printed in bold type for the first time in my life. They photographed me beside the orchid, my cane planted firm in the soil, and the story traveled farther than I ever dreamed. The state sent officials, not with bulldozers this time, but with documents granting funding to create a botanical center. They asked if I would stay on as caretaker, the official guardian of what I had once been mocked for calling my collection of weeds. I laughed, though tears blurred my eyes. "I'll stay as long as I can bend to touch the earth," I told them. The garden gates, once threatened with locks and chains, were opened wide. Visitors came, schoolchildren with wide eyes, professors with notebooks, neighbors carrying pies. They walked the same paths I had walked alone for decades, and they marveled at what grew quietly in the soil. My children didn't come. Not to the hearings, not to the celebrations, not to the opening of the new center. Their absence was a shadow I carried, but it no longer defined me. They had chosen their path and I had chosen mine. Sometimes love means letting the branches fall where they may. That first spring as guardian, I planted new rows, seeds gathered from friends, cuttings offered by botanical gardens, gifts from strangers who believed in preservation. I worked slower than before, my knees stiff, my hands less steady, but I worked still. Every bloom felt like a small victory. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the garden in gold, I sat on the bench Henry had built long ago. Children's laughter echoed by the gate, mingling with the hum of bees. I thought of him, of how he'd knelt in this same soil, planting roots neither of us knew would outlast us both. What once seemed like weeds had become a treasure. Not just for me, not just for this town, but for the world. And as I watched the orchids sway gently in the evening breeze, I knew the truth at last. I had not merely kept a garden. I had kept a promise that life, if tended with love, could outgrow greed, outlive betrayal, and bloom brighter than anyone believed possible. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.